morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. As always, I'm Amber Duke, joined at the table by Kevin Walling. Kevin, good to see you.
Amber, good to be with you. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Always love you joining on the end of the week. And we've got a big show for you today, but starting off right off the bat, Democrats are pulling out the big guns, as you see right behind us. Former President Barack Obama came out swinging at his first rally for vice president in 2024 Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania just last night. The former president, of course, took some jabs at former President Donald Trump, and he also had a message specifically for black men.
Part of it makes me think that, well, you just aren't feeling the idea of having a woman as president. And you're coming up with other alternatives and other reasons for them. And so now you're thinking about sitting out or even supporting somebody who has a history of denigrating you because you think that's a sign of strength, because that's what being a man is, putting women down. That's not acceptable.
And former President Bill Clinton will hit the campaign trail for the vice president this weekend in a push to gain support from rural voters across battleground states. Bill Clinton will begin his stops in Georgia on Sunday and is expected to continue through North Carolina next week.
Meanwhile, Trump gave remarks at the Detroit Economic Club yesterday, and in case you missed it, let's watch.
The whole country is going to be like, you want to know the truth? It'll be like Detroit. Our whole country will end up being like Detroit if she's your president. You're going to have a mess on your hands. She destroyed San Francisco. She destroyed, along with Newsom, California. And we're not going to let her do that to this country.
25 days away from the presidential election, it's looking like Republicans might take control of the Senate. The latest polling from the New York Times and Siena College shows Republicans leading in key Senate races, including Ted Cruz in Texas, Tim Sheehy in Montana, and Rick Scott in Florida. All right, so let's start right off the top with Obama's rally for Kamala Harris. I gotta say, Kevin, I found it a little bit weird that she wasn't there.
Well, I think it's like a divide and conquer operation, right? So, you know, obviously she had the Univision town hall. She was campaigning last night in Arizona. I think this is, 25 days out, all hands on deck, spreading everybody out. Barack Obama out there with Josh Shapiro, a very popular incumbent governor of Pennsylvania. Obviously something for Bob Casey as well. That some polling, and we can talk about some of these Senate races as you previewed. Some polling there is getting a little tighter in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as well. But certainly I think it's this all hands on deck approach. I want to hear your thoughts on, going to Detroit, the former president standing at that podium, Detroit Economic Club, and saying your city's going to heck, and let's not turn other places into Detroit.
Yeah, I mean, typically you would not advise a candidate to dump on the city that you're campaigning in, but I guess the question is, are the people of Detroit satisfied with what Detroit is like? I mean, it is a legitimate thing to raise the fact that their manufacturing has been hollowed out in a lot of ways. Crime is up pretty significantly. Housing is not in a great place. So maybe those people in the room appreciated that Trump was being honest about the state of Detroit. I know people have been trying to sell this idea of a Detroit resurgence. They point to factories like Shinola. I'm a big fan of their watches, I admit.
I do love Shinola watches too.
Right, great watches, but the net population growth last year was only plus 2,000. So I think maybe people are getting a little bit ahead of their skis on the great revitalization of Detroit. Look, everybody would love to see it happen. Detroit can be a great city. It has been a great city. But I guess I don't think it's as big of a blunder as people were trying to make it out to be. In fact, I don't think it was quite as bad as Obama lecturing black men about how they're misogynistic for not wanting to support Kamala Harris. I mean, it's kind of the same thing, right? You don't attack the city that you're campaigning in, and maybe you don't talk badly about the people whose votes you're trying to win over.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhat of a carrot and stick thing that, and I think the former president, in terms of Barack Obama, is uniquely positioned to have those kind of frank, honest conversations with folks He launched My Brother's Keeper and all that kind of stuff. And that's been a charism of his focus post-presidency, is engaging, especially with young black men. So I think, we'll see how that resonates with that key community. Obviously, there's some scary polling numbers, at least in that population, drifting towards Donald Trump. And obviously concerted efforts. You saw the vice president on, with two former NBA podcasters just last week. Other kind of more tailored, Howard Stern, another conversation from earlier this week, a concerted effort to reach out to those key populations that have been shifting away in some of these recent polls that could make a difference in some of these key congressional districts and obviously battleground states as well.
Yeah, and speaking of the polls, we do have some new polling on the Senate races, as we talked about. You mentioned Pennsylvania, where McCormick has closed the gap with Bob Casey. I think they're within 3 or 4 points, or McCormick is within 3 or 4 points now. He probably will also get a bump from the fact that Trump is on the ticket. So I expect that race to be pretty close. The sort of white whale that we've been talking about for Democrats is Ted Cruz's Senate seat in Texas, right? They tried to get him with Beto O'Rourke. He ended up winning by about 4 points. It looks like he'll probably end up winning this one by about 2 or 3 against Colin Allred. But they keep narrowing the gap. And I know that some people think that this is evidence that Texas is going blue. I'm not sure I buy that, because if we saw John Cornyn's race, a few years back, he ended up winning his seat by about 9 points. I think Ted Cruz is just uniquely unlikable. And you have to consider that Mitch McConnell, the Senate Leadership Fund, and pretty much everybody else in the Senate doesn't like Ted Cruz and doesn't invest any money in his races. He also has notorious grifter Jeff Rowe as his general campaign consultant. So I just would caution anybody thinking that there's so much you can read in the Ted Cruz tea leaves.
Yeah, and again, I think the previous results speak to that against Beto O'Rourke just 6 years ago. Morning Consult obviously ranks all 100 senators, and Ted Cruz is certainly massively underwater with in-state Republicans.
Right.
When it comes to that, also Colin Allred is has a compelling message, obviously compelling biography.
He's a good candidate.
NFL star. I mean, he's raising tons of money in that race, just as Beto O'Rourke did as well. We know in politics, money isn't everything. Mm-hmm. But one other race that's not been on a lot of people's radar is this Nebraska Senate race.
Right.
Democrats haven't fielded a candidate. There's an independent in that race.
Dan Osborne.
Dan Osborne, and some of the polling is certainly within the margin of error. Mitch McConnell, John Cornyn, other Republican Senate leadership probably doesn't want to be spending many resources in deeply red Nebraska, just like we don't want to be spending many resources in deeply blue Maryland, fending off Larry Hogan.
Sure.
But that's been interesting in terms of breaking polling information, at least now just about 3 weeks out.
Yeah, that is a very interesting race. The other ones that I'm watching, of course, are Michigan, where Mike Rogers has closed a bit of the gap there.
There were some fireworks in that debate just the other night between him and Elise Slotkin in that key race. That's a key hold for Democrats, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. And she's been sort of trying to distance herself from electric vehicle policies because of Michigan's reliance on the auto industry. Nevada with Sam Brown is another one to watch. And then
against Jackie Rosen.
Yes, yep. Exactly. And
another key hold for Democrats.
Yeah.
In that state.
And people might be surprised to hear that Carrie Lake is surprisingly close in Arizona to Ruben Gallego.
I don't know if I believe that.
We'll see.
Former Governor Lake or current Governor Lake
right.
coming closer.
Her and Stacey Abrams, right? And then Montana, the New York Times says he up 8 percentage points.
That's certainly
kind
giving
of a blowout,
Democrats
right?
the most heartburn in recent days and weeks. Obviously, John Tester has been there a number of cycles. He's a well-known quantity in that state. He's been able to hold on while the state breaks 20-plus points for Trump in the last 2 cycles. But he's running up against a young, attractive, well-financed candidate, and we'll see how Montana shakes out. That's a must-hold as well, with West Virginia obviously flipping to the Republicans with Joe Manchin's
Yeah, I think that's
departure.
a lost cause.
Yeah. That is something we agree on.
Yes. All right, we're going to keep following these Senate races and, of course, the presidential. We've got more to come here on Rising after this. Georgia has one of the strictest restrictions on abortion in the country. The state is home to the so-called heartbeat bill, meaning abortions are prohibited at 6 weeks of pregnancy. A lower court paused the state's near-total abortion ban last week, but on Monday, the Georgia Supreme Court reinstated the 2019 law, which is called the Life Act.
Georgia's flip-flopping on abortion is not only causing confusion among people, but also doctors who might perform the procedures. Dr. Mimi Zieman, an obstetrician in the Peach State, recently wrote an op-ed in USA Today titled, "I'm an OB-GYN in the South. Abortion bans make it impossible to do no harm." In the piece, she writes that before the restrictive law, she would, quote, "simply read a patient's chart to learn about her medical needs. Now the first thing I do is figure out where she lives. Is she local, from Georgia, where I work and I'm familiar with our strict abortion laws? Or is she from Alabama, Tennessee, or Mississippi, where abortion restrictions are even harsher?" Here to elaborate on how the Life Act is impacting her work and other OB-GYNs in the states with strict restrictions is Mimi herself. She's an obstetrician in Georgia and the author of many books, Managing Contraception and Tap Dancing on Everest. Welcome, Dr. Zieman, to Rising. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Dr. Zieman, I'd like to start with your op-ed from USA Today, and where you talk about states like Georgia, your home state, and Alabama with some of the strictest laws on the books with regards to abortion, and the fact that so many OB-GYNs are leaving those states. You've also seen a record drop in the number of residency applications for OB-GYNs folks in those states, and I wonder the real-world implications of that kind of brain drain of talented doctors leaving those states.
Yeah, and the reason I wrote that op-ed and other op-eds is for people to understand that these laws affect them, not just women of reproductive age. If we're losing medical professionals, there's going to be less care for all gynecologic conditions, fibroids, endometriosis, gynecologic cancer, heavy menstrual bleeding, and desired pregnancies, miscarriage care, as we've seen in so many very sad cases in the news. So the last thing I want is people to think this really doesn't affect me.
Could you talk a little bit about what portion of the law you specifically find confusing and you think is causing OB-GYNs to not know how to provide care to women?
I think it's hard, as you saw with the whiplash of just last week, where our law was blocked, our abortion ban was blocked and then reinstated. It's hard for people to even know what is the current law today. And that's a whiplash we've been seeing in our neighboring states as well, that have had laws enacted and then blocked and then reinstated. It's hard for medical professionals to keep up, and it's certainly hard for patients to know that they can access care. I'm sure many people have followed the 2 deaths in Georgia that were in the news, and one of the women didn't seek care because she didn't think that she could access care in our state.
Right, and so your first point is a criticism of the legal process for determining whether the law is allowed to stand, right? I guess I'm more curious about what it is in the laws that you think is causing doctors to feel like they can't provide miscarriage care. And do you think that doctors have a responsibility to inform women that laws like the one in Georgia do have exceptions for miscarriage care so that women aren't confused about it?
I think it's everyone's responsibility to know that miscarriage care is still allowable under the law. I'm concerned that abortion care is routine and essential medical care. Women have a right to that care. That's just under our healthcare system. We as doctors took oaths to provide evidence-based medical care that's just, that respects patients' autonomy and privacy. The reason our ban was blocked last week by Judge McBurney is because the Georgia Constitution says that we should have access based on privacy and personal liberty. And so it's our duty as citizens to vote to reverse these bans.
And Dr. Zieman, there's a number of those bans on the ballot, obviously in some key states like Florida and in Arizona. Certainly there are going to be a lot of political ramifications with these issues that we've seen in states from Kentucky to Kansas to Ohio that have all voted to support and enshrine in law access to abortion in some of these really Republican states. One of the key things that you point out in this op-ed as well is the fact that so many women now in the wake of the Dobbs decision are traveling out of state for care. 1 in 5 women just last year. That's double the number that we saw in 2000. I wonder if you could also speak to the fact that so many women have to travel to access that care. They're in a community that they might not know, seeking medical support from medical professionals that don't know these patients, and really what the ramifications of that are.
Yeah, it's so egregious to think, oh, women can just travel, so it's no big deal. Traveling is incredibly stressful. Of course, the stress is worse on people of low income. Taking time off work, taking time from caring for their other children at home, finding the funds to travel for care. This shouldn't be happening in the USA. People should be able to access essential care at home. So while anti-abortion activists enacted these bans to protect fetuses, what they are doing is harming and punishing women. Women are still accessing abortions. Not everyone, but the number of abortions has actually increased in the US post-Dobbs. So the anti-abortion activists are not really realizing their objectives. There are workarounds such as travel, but these are truly harming and punishing women. A day doesn't go by that I don't see women crying, sobbing, screaming and shouting when they can't just access basic health care. We had this right to health care for 50 years, and we shouldn't stand for having this right taken away. It's limiting women's access to self-determination, to economic stability, to control over their bodies. We don't force men to undergo procedures or not have access to procedures, so it's unjust to do so just to half the population.
And Dr. Zieman, it also has real-world implications for the disparities that are really now even more on display within our healthcare system. The fact that Black women are, in Georgia, your home state, are 3 times more likely to die from a birth procedure than white women. You rightly point out that it's not easy, especially for a lot of women on the lower end of the economic spectrum. Obviously, people of color trying to travel out of state get time off, especially if they work in hourly jobs. And it's really disheartening to see just those different discrepancies, especially when it comes to people's race and economic status.
Absolutely. And the states with bans have higher maternal mortalities overall. This is one of the reasons why these bans are so unjust, because they are affecting certain populations more than others. But just the fact that forcing someone to carry a pregnancy to term has a maternal mortality rate of 35 to 39 times higher than having a safe elective abortion procedure is not fair. Why should we be doing that to people, forcing them to do something that they don't want that carries such higher risks?
One final question for you, because as a medical provider, certainly you know that this is not just about women's bodily autonomy, but also the unborn fetus in the womb, right? So how do you factor that into your equation when you're talking about abortion as healthcare and how this is an essential right for women?
I think that everyone should make that decision for themselves. If they are more concerned about the fetus in their body, then they should not have an abortion. But they should not put that religious or philosophical belief on other people. They have that belief based on their religious opinions. Other religions have other ideas of when life begins, what constitutes a human person, and that should not be forced on other people. I respect their belief to decide not to have an abortion.
Right, but there are a lot of people who have objections to abortion that are not religious. They say that they have scientific objections. I mean, what does your medical education say about when the life of a fetus begins?
It's not, well, pregnancy begins at implantation. Medicine doesn't decide when life begins, and neither does science. So your question was, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, I'm just curious, when you're as a doctor, right? When you are treating a woman who has a pregnancy, at what point do you believe, based on your medical education, that the fetus becomes a life worth protecting?
Oh, I believe in the guidelines set forth by Roe v. Wade, that when the fetus can survive on its own outside the body, then protections make sense.
Okay, so you would support limits on abortions in the third trimester?
I would.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Zieman. We appreciate you coming on Rising today.
Thank you.
Well, a new movie is hitting the big screen about former President Donald Trump's life. The Apprentice, starring Marvel's Sebastian Stan and Succession's Jeremy Strong, is causing quite the stir.
The controversial film, dubbed the Trump movie Trump Doesn't Want You to See, centers around Trump as an apprentice for Roy Cohn, attorney, New York power broker, and top aide to Senator Joseph McCarthy. Take a look.
Hello, this is Donald Trump from Mr. Cohn. Thank you so much.
Donald who?
1, 2, 3, 4!
Roy Cohn, nice to meet you.
The Roy Cohn, you're brutal.
Guilty as charged.
How do you always win?
There's rules. The first rule is attack, attack, attack.
It's going to be the finest building in the city, maybe the country, in the world.
Rule 2, admit nothing, deny everything.
There's never been anything like this, of this magnitude, this quality. Ooh, cheese balls over here.
What are you doing?
You want one?
No, it looks totally disgusting.
Cheese balls.
Rule 3, no matter what happens, you claim victory and never admit defeat. You have to be willing to do anything to anyone to win. You have a big ass. You got to work on that.
Your face looked like an orange.
Attack, attack, attack.
Deny everything, admit nothing.
Never admit defeat.
What if you lost your fortune today?
Well, then maybe I'll run for president. I don't know.
I say, if you're indicted, you're invited.
Well, the film has been seen as a political lightning rod for Hollywood. Trump campaign spokesperson Stephen Chung threatened to file a lawsuit to block the film's release, saying, quote, "This garbage is pure fiction, which sensationalizes lies that have been long debunked."
Since then, the film has garnered the attention of many political actors. Former Trump campaign advisor Roger Stone posted this on X. "I knew Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was a friend of mine. The portrayal of Roy Cohn by actor Jeremy Strong in the new movie The Apprentice is uncanny in its accuracy." So, I don't know, Kevin, are you going to see the movie?
Comes out Friday. I don't even know where we can see it. I know there were issues with distribution, so I don't know even where it's playing in this area. I know there was a preview this past week for some politicos in D.C. at Alamo Drafthouse, I think is where the premiere was. It certainly wasn't at the MPA or other more famous theaters in D.C., but it's, the trailer looks pretty compelling. I don't know. Are you going to see it?
I don't think Sebastian Stan's Trump impression is very good.
He got the voice down kind of when he was knocking on the door at the beginning.
I'm curious to see Jeremy Strong as Roy Cohn. I mean, I guess I understand Trump's objection to the movie. Obviously, it contains a very graphic rape scene with an actress who's portraying his ex-wife, Ivana Trump. She accused him of sexual assault in a divorce filing, but then later walked back the claims and said that they never happened. And then I guess they have some issues with other portrayals in the movie that they say are inaccurate. And I mean, when you're a public figure that's still running as a candidate for political office, I can understand why you would have an issue with a movie that might have false portrayals or claims in it, and why you might want
sensationalized
definitely sensationalized
elements of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't fault Trump for trying to
wanting
file
to stop this. Yeah,
yeah, exactly, and I doubt it's it's probably less because there's a movie about him. I mean, the guy would probably love to have a movie about him, and more that.
Especially with some of these high-level actors, Jeremy Strong has quite a following.
It just seems like it's intended to be, like you said, very sensationalized, very intentionally negative about his rise, and I think maybe like a balanced documentary might be more.
I mean, funny enough to your point, Amber, some folks on the left who have seen it were saying it actually paints Donald Trump in a sympathetic light for a lot of it. Obviously, you talked about the rape scene that has gotten a lot of attention, but the fact that he was a hard scrabble guy that all these elders in New York were saying build elsewhere, and he had this vision to build Trump Tower and going against the grain. The movie's getting attacked from the left that it makes this young portrayal of Donald Trump to be sympathetic. Obviously, no one's happy with it on either end.
Well, that's the problem, is that you can't win, right?
Yeah.
I mean, somebody's going to be upset about everything. I don't know. I don't feel very strongly about it. I know India has banned at least the rape scene entirely because they say that it's too graphic, and then some other portions that are considered a bit too explicit. I doubt the U.S. is going to do the same. I mean, we have like the worst movies ever with insane things in them. So,
and again, I mean, timing to your point too, right? We're 25 days out from this election. Certainly, something that Donald Trump really probably doesn't want to be talking about or answering for. I thought it was interesting the quote that you read from Roger Stone, who was a long confidant of Roy Cohn. I think they worked together on a number of campaigns, saying that Jeremy Strong's role of him was pretty spot on.
Well, Jeremy Strong is known for being a very intense method actor.
He's a very interesting character.
There was a profile that came out about him when he was in Succession, playing Kendall Roy, the eldest Roy son. And some of the things that he was doing to stay in character and prepare for the role were absolutely bonkers. And you could tell by the comments made by his fellow actors on the show that they were not super thrilled with his behavior.
What was it, Brian Cox, that was just like, this guy's a Looney Tune, like condemning, which I thought was
saying how crazy
funny.
It was. And they were trying to compare him to like Daniel Day-Lewis, and I think it kind of harkens back to that famous quote, which is, have you ever tried acting?
I love that.
Yeah.
And again, obviously, this is not the first political portrayal of an individual, right? I remember, years ago with Oliver Stone's W about George W. Bush. I think it did come out around. I think it came out during the Bush administration, and that kind of being widely panned for some of the sensational elements of that, and probably a frustration, obviously, on President George W. Bush's point from this portrayal. So we're not new to these kinds of movies, and we'll again see if it resonates with audiences. Part of it is the frustrations around this distribution deal as well. I think folks, especially big agencies in Hollywood, were hesitant to take this on, especially the distribution rights, with the idea that there might be a lawsuit. Funny enough, Donald Trump, who loves to sue everything and everybody and everyone, threatened this lawsuit. Stephen Chang, his spokesperson, previewed that when it premiered in Cannes. And the fact that he didn't follow through with it, I think, maybe he didn't want to raise the profile of this movie in a legal battle, but it's kind of interesting that he held his fire with that threat of a lawsuit.
Yeah, I do wonder if it's more of a calculation of avoiding too much attention, and it doesn't seem like it's gonna be super gangbusters when it premieres in theaters, so maybe you just kind of let it die out. Your point about the W film is an interesting one. I mean, they also did the Vice film about Dick Cheney.
Oh yeah, that's a great point
too.
But
there is always a danger, I think, even it's just from a more general principle of releasing a movie or even writing a book about something that's ongoing, right? Because you risk either getting things wrong, because situations, especially in a White House, are changing very rapidly, certainly on a political campaign, et cetera. But when someone is still a public figure, what if their reputation completely changes by the time they leave public life?
I mean, Vice is, open back up the screenplay for Vice and have Dick Cheney endorsing Kamala Harris.
Like, that's always the danger.
15 years later, it's kind of interesting in terms of the strange bedfellows with that.
Yeah, well, I have to admit, I'm probably not going to see it. I honestly don't really like political movies anyway. I don't even like political books. When I'm off camera, I like to do non-political things. But
that's how you save a lot of gray hairs and a lot of stress.
That's what I try to do. But if you see it, or if you know someone who sees it, you should tell me what you think.
I will.
All right, we're going to be back. More Rising after this. The Trump White House is being accused of witness tampering. A new report out from the Senate Judiciary Committee alleges that the Trump White House blocked the FBI's investigation of Justice Brett Kavanaugh before he was named to the Supreme Court. The investigation, which was led by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse 6 years after he launched a Senate inquiry, reported that the Trump White House prohibited the FBI from choosing whom to interview and from following up on potential leads that might have corroborated the allegations of sexual harassment laid out by Christine Blasey Ford.
Remember the explosive hearings that took place in 2018 in the wake of Me Too? To jog your memory, on September 12, 2018, allegations of sexual misconduct by Kavanaugh, which had not been uncovered during the FBI's full-field background investigation, began to surface. Over the next few days, senators and the public learned of accusations by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford that Kavanaugh had sexually assaulted her while the two were in high school. According to a letter Ford sent to Senator Dianne Feinstein, then the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, quote, Brett Kavanaugh physically and sexually assaulted during high school in the early 1980s by locking her in a bedroom, climbing on top of her, attempting to remove her clothes, and putting his hand over her mouth to stop her from screaming. Kavanaugh publicly denied Ford's allegations. After Ford came forward, new allegations of sexual misconduct by Kavanaugh emerged, most notably from Deborah Ramirez, a classmate of Kavanaugh's at Yale University. On September 23, 2018, The New Yorker reported Ramirez's allegation that while in college, Kavanaugh exposed himself at a drunken dormitory party, thrust his genital in her face, and caused her to touch it without her consent as she pushed him away. Kavanaugh denied all those allegations.
In the end, it became a case of he said, she said. The report says that the Trump administration, quote, exercised total control over the scope of the investigation and prevented the FBI from interviewing certain witnesses and following leads. As a result, the probe into the allegations against Kavanaugh was, quote, flawed and incomplete and unworthy of reliance by the Senate, the report says. While President Trump publicly claimed the FBI had free rein to take any investigative steps it deemed necessary, although the Trump administration and the FBI assured the Senate that the FBI's investigation was being conducted by the book, they failed to disclose that there was actually no, quote, book at all, according to the report.
Pretty incredible report to come out now 6 years. It's amazing that it's been 6 years since that explosive hearing. I remember watching it live, obviously Dr. Ford's testimony, and then Brett Kavanaugh's response that, got pretty heated. Obviously, then SNL, it became lore after the fact with SNL lampooning the entire process. But certainly damning allegations of what the FBI did and failed to do in this report, Amber.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when you go back to what was actually happening here, I don't find it really that explosive. We do know that the FBI had already conducted 6 background checks by the time Christine Blasey Ford came forward with her allegations, and the FBI has released a statement in response to this report indicating that they followed the normal protocol, which is that when there is a supplemental background investigation into someone who is going through a Senate confirmation process, the White House does direct the scope of the investigation, which in this case was to find out more information about Christine Blasey Ford and Deborah Ramirez's allegations, and then the FBI typically has free rein, as Trump put it, to determine how exactly it is they want to corroborate or prove that these allegations did not happen. And they did interview all of the firsthand witnesses aside from Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford, who at that point had both already testified publicly in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So they talked to Mark Judge, who was the only firsthand witness of the alleged Christine Blasey Ford assault, who has vehemently denied it all the way through. And then Leland Kaiser, I'm not sure if she was actually ever interviewed by the FBI, but I do know that she publicly rejected the allegation. She was a close friend of Christine Blasey Ford. And I do find it a little bit ironic that Senator Whitehouse and some of the other Democrats who are reacting to this report would accuse the Trump White House of witness tampering when people close to Christine Blasey Ford called Leland Kaiser at the time and encouraged her to change her story when Christine Blasey Ford went public.
I mean, one of the amazing things, and you just said too, that there was no follow-up by the FBI to directly interview Dr. Ford. I don't believe they interviewed Ms. Ramirez as well. And the reports suggested that there were 20 other former classmates, names that Ms. Ramirez gave to the FBI that would corroborate at least what had happened during the Yale incident and the Yale years. And the FBI failed to bring those folks in. I know timing was of the essence, obviously. Jeff Flake, others delayed the hearing because they wanted this full field background check. 8 of those senators, Republican senators, cited that FBI report clearing, at that time, Judge Kavanaugh of these accusations as the reason why they voted for him in the end, in a vote that was 50 to 48, really tight vote, obviously back 6 years ago. But the fact that so many of these folks that were willing to testify on the record, at least in the Ramirez case from Yale, that the FBI failed to even have that conversation or a follow-up conversation with Dr. Ford. I know she testified under oath for many hours, led by Republicans and Democrats on that Judiciary Committee. But the fact that there was no sit-down and Dr. Ford's attorney requested that sit-down with Dr. Ford was pretty extraordinary. Yeah,
I do recall that early on in the process, I believe she was offered to come in for an FBI interview and declined that offer, and then decided to, of course, she was compelled to testify publicly in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So it was a little interesting that her team suddenly wanted to do the FBI interview weeks later when they opened the supplemental investigation. But I'm not sure I buy the idea that Deborah Ramirez had offered up all of these firsthand witnesses, because when this New Yorker story first came out, they actually admitted in the story that none of the other people who were supposedly at this party were either willing or had any knowledge of this alleged incident. They said that they didn't remember anything like that ever happening. Deborah Ramirez was the only firsthand witness who was willing to attest to this. So I'm not sure I buy the idea that she suddenly had 20 witnesses that she was offering up to the FBI who believed or saw that this occurred. And then one of the other complaints in this report is the individual by the name of Mr. Steyer, who says that he knew of another victim of Brett Kavanaugh, and the alleged victim in that case was interviewed by the media as well and said she had no recollection of the incident. So this coming out 6 years later seems a little bit convenient to me. I mean, sure, maybe it took them 6 years to gather all of this supposed evidence, but this was fully litigated, I think, at the time. I mean, if not in the media, then certainly in the Senate Judiciary Committee. The FBI looked into all of the firsthand witnesses according to their purview laid out by the White House, and saying, well, they didn't interview so-and-so's friend who heard about it 3 years later, that just doesn't pass muster for me.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously an exhaustive process led by Senator Whitehouse. It reminds me of the other exhaustive process led by Dianne Feinstein when it came to the torture memos and the CIA, kind of a single-handed investigation by a sitting member of the Senate. One of the other fascinating things that came out of that report, too, was the fact that the FBI tip line for any kind of evidence to come forward, for people's recollections to be shared with the FBI, was forwarded to the Trump. The information from that tip line was forwarded to the Trump White House. I don't know if that's been the case with other judicial nominees. Obviously, the president is the head of the Judiciary Department, sets the scope of those investigations. The FBI ultimately is an executive branch agency. But if that's the case for other investigations, that is pretty questionable, I think, as a process goes, that a partisan political operation would receive the evidence from the FBI in that tip line ahead of time.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the standard for that typically is, and obviously the FBI wouldn't have time to investigate. I think they got 4,000 tips during that period.
Is that right? Okay.
So it was in the thousands, according to the report, which is crazy. I don't know what the standard process for that is. I can't say. I think if there's anything that the Democrats should be a little bit careful about with this type of report, which makes this sort of more generalized allegation that the FBI and the White House are very intrinsically linked, right? That the FBI is something that is under the purview of the White House, according to the steps that the Trump White House took in this case. There would be a lot less daylight between Merrick Garland and Joe Biden, which would potentially give more credence to allegations that Merrick Garland and the DOJ right now are engaging in political prosecutions against Donald Trump. So I think that would be something that I would be a little bit careful about if I were a Democrat.
Well, more to come on, certainly on that front. Obviously, there's a new book, Bob Woodward, coming out next week where, it's reported that Joe Biden has been furious with Merrick Garland. Certainly more to come, I think, on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to keep following it right here on Rising. We have a lot more to cover. Stay tuned. Vice President Kamala Harris had an awkward hot mic moment Wednesday as she appeared to stumble through a live Zoom press conference on Hurricane Milton. Caught on video during the Zoom briefing, which featured President Joe Biden, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, and 4 other officials, Harris covers her mouth in an apparent attempt to covertly communicate with her team. And come to find out, it looks like the VP staff was feeding her questions to ask before she covered her mouth and warned them it's a live broadcast.
The hot mic moment wasn't Harris's only faux pas this week. She dialed into the Weather Channel and tried to explain the difference between a Category 5 and 4 hurricane. Watch here.
The other point, Mike, that I would make, especially it came through on the briefing from the federal experts, it's really important that we think about the language that we're using to talk about what we are predicting. Because, for example, it has moved from time to time from a Category 5 to a Category 4. It's important that we not emphasize that downgrading has happened because, in fact, the difference between Category 5 and Category 4 in terms of the danger and the damage is pretty much the same.
It's a good reminder that that mic is always hot, no matter the situation or circumstance. Obviously, it's not new to have principals, be fed notes, questions to ask. Same thing happened during all the previous administrations, presidents being handed cards to say something or to speak out about something. It's just I think probably the latest in a long lines of attacks on the vice president when it comes to these kinds of things.
I think you're right that obviously people get notes in advance and they get prepared questions that they're supposed to ask during these briefings from their staff. That's why you have a staff, is to help prepare you for these types of events. But I'm curious why they were talking to her during the broadcast. Like, that should be on your piece of paper.
I mean, that's like a
right?
staffing issue more than any. Like, the staff should know better.
Right.
Not to, it's a live feed. Not to be talking during it to her,
They should have known that. She should have muted her mic before saying, it's a live feed. Just not a good look. And then the Weather Channel interview, I don't think was that bad, but it kind of reminded me of this, the moment she had when she was explaining the Ukraine-Russia war. And she's like, well, Russia's a bigger country and it took over Ukraine, a smaller country, and that's bad. But in isolation, none of these are terrible, but
Sure.
it is due to the fact that there seems to be this pattern of sort of Veep-like moments surrounding Kamala Harris and some of her word salads that she likes to throw out. It gives people a laugh.
Well, so I think I give her a lot of credit for going on those channels. I think it's important now. People are saying that, well, the vice president really doesn't have a role in this. And what I've been saying in response is she's now the de facto leader of the Democratic Party, right? It is important, for her to have that conversation with Ron DeSantis to show that this is a nonpartisan response to these horrific storms that have back-to-back devastated so many communities in the South. And I think it's important for her to be out there. She's not a meteorologist, to your point, in terms of not getting some of those facts correct on the ground. But I think it's critically important for there to be a united message and to push back on so much of the misinformation, disinformation that's been coming out in the last couple of weeks, ever since Helene hit, and then obviously into Milton. I
am kind of curious about what exactly her role is, because I can't find any evidence that she ever tried to call Ron DeSantis before during previous natural disasters in Florida. And so although she is, of course, the leader of the Democratic Party now, she is running for the presidency, we do still have a president who said that he talked to Governor DeSantis, that he thinks he's doing a great job. DeSantis, in turn, says that he's happy to take phone calls from the president. So at the same time that obviously the campaign wants to show she has some kind of executive experience. 100%. Certainly they want to give the perception that she is a leader in some right. But if she hasn't really been there talking to these governors for the past 3.5 years, and she just kind of swoops in one of the biggest moments with so much devastation, wouldn't you feel as a governor that she was being politically opportunistic? So again, and I go back to the idea that she's no longer kind of just the normal backseat vice president anymore. She is driving a lot of this administration response now because she is that nominee and the de facto leader of the party. And again, I think from a visual standpoint, it's obviously important from a campaign standpoint, right? As the only second woman to run, there's a lot of knocks about women in politics that they're not strong enough. Obviously, running for an executive position, you want to be out there with that, that jacket with the seal on the ground, meeting with those folks. And she has done that in the past for other storms, but her role is obviously much more elevated, given the fact that we're 4 weeks out from the election and she is the nominee. Yeah, and I think her campaign really bungled this in the beginning with the response to Hurricane Helene, because if it is their goal to show that she's going to be this strong leader who's able to respond to these incidents, they should not have had her campaigning in Las Vegas until Sunday night, which was basically 2 full days after Hurricane Helene hit. And then she taped the Call Her Daddy interview in California on Monday morning before returning to the White House for an in-person briefing. At that point, Trump was already on the ground in Georgia. Biden actually made it back to the White House from his Rehoboth Beach vacation before Kamala Harris did. So from an optics standpoint, I mean, that was a huge error on that part, and definitely gave the impression to a lot of people on the ground that she didn't really care. She was just coming through for her photo op.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly going to be the Republican attack against her. And again, I think what you're seeing is an effort by this administration, especially elevating her, that trying to combat the issue of misinformation, disinformation out there. I thought it was interesting to see, this response from Chuck Edwards, a fairly new member of Congress, Republican from North Carolina, who had to come out publicly and debunk a number of these claims floated by his colleagues in the House, by the former president himself, in terms of issues of relief funds being diverted away from the response to migrants, which has been debunked up and down. You saw a really, I think, agitated, upset, angry commander-in-chief yesterday, taking on those lies, taking on what former President Trump has said in the wake of these horrific tragedies, trying to politicize those. And again, we'll see how those dynamics play out. I think the response is also going to be critically important over these next 4 weeks. I think the administration has been out in front, especially on Milton. But we've got 4 weeks to handle this, continue to hopefully handle this correctly, and that is not always the case. We've seen it with Sandy, right, with Chris Christie and the embrace of Obama and the political dynamics of that, with Charlie Crist in Florida with a hurricane response. So while there's incredible tragedy and suffering on the ground, there's also political ramifications for these responses.
Yeah, very true. And I was glad to see that J.D. Vance, who of course is Trump's running mate, clarified what is going on with FEMA and the Migrant Shelter Fund, which is that up until 2023, the funds did come from FEMA to shelter undocumented immigrants, or illegal aliens, as I call them. And then in 2023 to 2024, fiscal year 2023, they created a new fund through CBP, which is then distributed through FEMA. And I think the argument or the criticism is, some people have gotten this wrong because they've conflated it as FEMA's actually taking funds away from disaster relief, which is not true. But it's a case of mission creep, right? Like, is this really what FEMA should have its focus on when there are these natural disasters that are affecting so many Americans? But I mean, I guess it's an argument for a different day.
And it's super complicated, right?
Yeah.
It's pots of money, different agencies.
Right.
It's kind of in the woods on a lot of in the high grass and a lot of this kind of stuff. When Trump has a fairly effective argument to be made, if it's just the top line number.
Right, exactly. I mean, he can just say FEMA has mission creep. It's spending millions of dollars on this other charge, or billions of dollars on this other charge, when it should have a more narrow focus on disaster relief. And that's a perfectly effective political message.
And we'll see how it plays out.
We will.
Less than 4 weeks out.
More on Rising after this.
Well, Hurricane Milton is shining a spotlight on the political conversation around climate change and the impact of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' decision to sign legislation that erased most, quote, climate change references from state law in May of this year. When DeSantis signed this bill, which would repeal green energy grants and make it easier to transport natural gas, forecasters were predicting a record number of hurricanes, and the Washington Post was reporting that Florida is among 8 coastal states particularly at risk from rising sea levels. The legislation got rid of 50 references in state law to combat climate change, according to Boca magazine. Now, just days after Hurricane Milton brought deadly tornadoes, life-threatening flooding, and widespread devastation throughout Florida, concerns about Ron DeSantis' approach to the climate crisis, as well as future natural disasters across, quote, the South, the drowning South, are rising. Yesterday, Governor DeSantis spoke for the first time since Milton hit.
We're going to continue to support all remaining rescue missions that are underway and that may be needed in the near future. We'll also continue to assess the damage that was done from the storm. We also anticipate that because of the amount of water, you may see flooding happen not just now, but in the subsequent days.
So Amber, thoughts on now the legislation that the governor signed back in May isn't just dealing with the nomenclature of climate change, but also obviously natural gas, offshore wind in terms of different policy positions of that bill. But certainly the key thing that's getting a lot of attention is his focus on taking climate change out of any state law.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that spending a bunch of taxpayer money on creating clean energy infrastructure is going to keep Florida safe from hurricanes is a bit of a pipe dream. And when you actually go through the bill, he talks about specifically using fossil fuels, natural gas, et cetera, to shore up the electricity grid, to build defenses from rising seas, to help keep Floridians safe from the effects of hurricanes. Now, the underlying argument, of course, would be, do you believe that human-driven climate change is going to increase the severity of hurricanes to a point that will outweigh the potential benefits that you get from better infrastructure from fossil fuel use? And I personally don't buy that argument. I don't think that they're going to get so extreme from me using a can of hairspray that
Me too. I use it all the time to keep this mop in place.
That Ron DeSantis' bill really is going to have an impact on that. This is a political football, obviously.
And kind of on that line of thoughts of the idea that it's a political football, one of the interesting things in some of the reporting that I saw is this Florida Atlantic University poll. 90% of Floridians believe that climate change is real, including a good number of Republicans, and 70% of those respondents think that the state should be doing more to combat the effects of climate change. Is there a worry that Governor DeSantis is out of step with the vast majority of Floridians?
Maybe, but I do think that there's been so much media prognosticating and fear-mongering about the impacts of climate change that people have this unrealistic idea that the Green New Deal, for example, is going to save us all from global warming. And then, of course, there's trade-offs to that, too, even if you do believe that, which haven't really been addressed. But I haven't really seen any evidence that all of this change to our infrastructure is going to significantly change the climate. I mean, we're not even the biggest polluter, not even close, really. I mean, if you look at what China's doing, what India's doing, our reduction of fossil fuel use to slightly reduce our carbon output would have very minimal impact on the global effect of pollution and carbon emissions. So I think, again, the underlying question that people have to grapple with is not, is climate change real? I think everybody agrees, based on scientific evidence, that the climate has increased by, 0.001% in temperature, or whatever it is, 1 degree Celsius, and is projected to increase slightly more. But it's what should the government do to address climate change, right? And that's where people disagree. And unfortunately, the conversation often comes out where if someone like Ron DeSantis says, I don't think Florida's priority should be making offshore wind turbines, I think we should be shoring up infrastructure to make sure people's houses don't get blown away by hurricanes, they say he's a climate denier. And I don't think that's productive at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a political, prognosticator. I work in campaigns. And I just wonder the political realities of, the Governor DeSantis signing this bill in May, then leading into record heat indexes in Florida month over month, and then into these two devastating hurricanes, that this idea that, we're so focused on just removing, the name, banning books and things like that, that Democrats love to attack the governor on, that there could be some political metal with that, especially with this polling that so many folks believe that the state should be doing more when it comes to combating climate change.
I think that DeSantis is a skilled enough politician and communicator that he can make the case for
weave that
this
narrative.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for one, yes, temperatures were hot this year. I think people need to understand that there's actually more lives saved from the temperature being slightly warmer than if it were to be slightly colder, because we have more deaths from cold temperatures than from warm temperatures, at least in the United States. I'm not sure if that holds globally.
Amber endorsing warmer temps.
I mean, that's why we have air conditioning. I mean, obviously some people don't have air conditioning, but again, the point is that we rely on cheap cheap, reliable, and abundant energy in order to heat and cool our homes, in order to build great buildings that are going to withstand all kinds of natural disasters. And if we were to just pivot to so-called clean energy or green energy, we wouldn't have the ability to do these things on the large scale that we do now. We've seen climate-related deaths drop 98% in the last century because of our advanced technology that we have been so blessed to have in this country. And I really worry about what would happen to low-income folks who don't have access to the type of money that it might require to have a house outfitted with solar panels or to have an electric vehicle. Like, what's going to happen to them if we suddenly end our reliance on fossil fuels? That's what concerns me.
And I think it's a point well taken. And a lot of these populations are dealing with the effects of climate change in a much more significant fashion because they don't have the ability to access those grants, those subsidies to break into that middle class. And we're leaving, I think, those folks certainly behind. And I do think, you have a lot of movement from young conservatives, interestingly enough, that are trying to pull their party closer towards this is real, this is happening, and Republicans can win some of these arguments if we're smart about it. And you have some of these leading kind of younger conservatives, that are pro-conservation conservatives out there, and I wonder just how effective they will be in terms of bringing their party elders along.
Yeah, that's interesting. The Steamboat Institute, where I'm a fellow, just had a debate with Benji Backer, who is the head of
ACC,
the
right,
American Conservation Coalition, which is, as you said, a group of conservatives who are interested in conservation.
Mostly young Republican
Exactly.
voters.
They had a debate between him and I'm failing to recall who the other side was, but they had a debate about whether or not electric vehicles are basically one of the proper solutions to climate change. And it's a really interesting debate. I encourage everybody to watch it. Steamboat's doing stuff like that all the time on college campuses. It's very, very cool. Alex Epstein's another great resource for some of these climate change, I call it fear-mongering, because a lot of it does really go beyond, okay, the planet is warming 1 degree Celsius on average every decade. Is that something to be worried about? And if so, what should we do about it? Into, oh my God, if we don't change everything in 10 years, like AOC or Greta Thunberg says, then we're all going to die. That's not helpful. Yeah,
I do think we hear from the extremes so much on this particular issue that have outsized voices. One point of agreement that we're certainly in on is the fact that China is so far out in terms of leading some of the worst environmental disasters, situations in that country, leading to the rising climate because of their factories, because of their lack of any kind of regulation, because they're so focused on just turning out cheap products and things like that, to say nothing of Uyghur labor and things like that. The effects that they're doing to this planet are devastating. Yeah, and I think that's why I was very critical of the Paris Climate Accords and things like it, because we were in it with countries that were not taking any of the regulations seriously. So it was like a sham deal. Like, what is the point of being in this if we're not actually going to hold anybody accountable to the standards that we've come up with in this? And the U.S. is the only one that's actually taking it seriously. I mean, certainly China is the most egregious actor in this front. I would say on Paris, I think, the more the merrier in terms of trying to put pressure on China. But as we know, China and India to a large degree are so focused on industrialization at the cost of this planet that we're likely not to see action from them. Well, I'm glad we agree that China is a bigger threat than Governor DeSantis. We do agree on that. All right, we're going to take a quick break and be back with more Rising after this. In an interview on Thursday with ABC's Good Morning America, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz backpedaled on his statement to eliminate the Electoral College. He aligned himself instead with the position of the Harris-Walz campaign and said, quote, "My position is the campaign's position." Let's watch.
Do you think that Biden's done everything right?
Well, look, I don't know if any of us do everything right, but I can tell you he's done everything in the best interest of the American public. He's listened to what the public did. He's asked for answers, and I think, and reevaluated afterwards.
Despite the campaign's current position, in a 2019 interview on Jimmy Kimmel Live, Vice President Kamala Harris toyed with the idea of abolishing the Electoral College. Let's watch.
Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren, had a town hall last night, and she said that she thinks we should do away with the Electoral College. Do you agree with that?
I think that I'm open to the discussion. I mean, there's no question that the popular vote has been diminished in terms of making the final decision about who's the president of the United States, and we need to deal with that. So I'm open to the discussion.
Okay, so another little campaign blunder, unfortunately this time from Tim Walz. This
Not
was
people on the same page, certainly.
Clearly not. I mean, this was apparently during a fundraiser, I believe, with donors, where he was recorded saying that he would support eliminating the Electoral College. Not a great look as the campaign is trying to win over rural voters, surely.
Yeah, I mean, again, and he had to backpedal on that. I think the remarks were made actually at Gavin Newsom's residence in Sacramento for donors. And I think it's in the context of it, from what I read from Governor Walz, is the frustration that, since he's joined the ticket, he's really only traveled to 7 states. And I think that's actually, a disadvantage for, someone coming in. Obviously, he's been on the political scene, was in Congress, got 2-term governor of Minnesota. But the fact that, they're spending all of their time in these key states and not, obviously seeing the rest of the country, may be an argument to open the conversation, as Kamala Harris suggested, which is the perfect answer for that. Just like packing the Supreme Court, we'll open the conversation or study it.
Open the conversation about abolishing ICE.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we will
she loves to have
start that conversation because there is this fear that with population changing and folks moving to inner cities and other states, that you're going to be so far out of the public will that, what was it, 40,000 votes this last go-round between Biden and Trump could have flipped the Electoral College, even though President Biden won the popular vote by 7.5 million votes.
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously our country was designed that way, and I think it's fair to point out that the swing states have not always been the same, right?
That's true.
They change pretty frequently, even within a decade or so, because of the population movement, because of even the movement of people's political ideals. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the Midwest was a blue wall. Trump broke the blue wall in 2016. Biden won some of it back in 2020. So none of this is really fixed or set in stone, and is really, I think, vital to making sure that people who are in what many call flyover country do have a stake in what happens in the national presidential election. Our founders wanted our country to have representation that way. And so I don't care for the idea of getting rid of the Electoral College at all. I mean, because then you have what is the election being decided by California and New York any better than the election being decided by 7
Sign me up for that.
I'm sure you would be. I'm sure you would be.
I mean, the interesting thing, I was watching a documentary not too long ago about the Ford-Carter election in '76, and the fact, to your point, Amber, that at that time there were like 25 states. That were kind of within the margin, where they had to really spend time on the ground in each of those states. And we've seen over time that number kind of dwindle. It's varied a little bit between 5 and 10, but that's certainly been the case over the last couple of cycles, that it really is these key deciding states. Now we'll see, our conversation earlier about, Texas. That's been the white whale for Democrats for the longest time, with changing demographics there. That margin was a lot closer for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and Joe Biden and Donald Trump, than places like Ohio and Iowa that were at one point bellwether states that went back and forth. But it is interesting to kind of see the changing demographics on the ground.
There are also different political strategies into winning a popular vote versus an electoral vote.
That's a very good point. Yep.
Election, right? We don't actually know that California is as blue as people say, because a lot of Republicans don't vote because they feel like their vote doesn't matter. It's possible that in a popular vote election that Republicans could run up the score in places like Texas and Florida, and maybe get some of those disaffected voters in places like New York and California.
Sounds like you might be open to the conversation if it motivates blue state Republicans to turn out.
I'm not opening any conversation. I'm just playing devil's advocate that obviously the strategy is different for these two systems. So we don't even really know what would happen in a popular vote system, because the campaigns would be doing entirely different things than they're doing right now. So Tim Walz could complain about having to visit 7 states, but if it were a popular vote, maybe he'd spend all of his time in California. I mean,
or in population centers.
Yeah,
certainly.
exactly. So we don't know that. I mean, to me, this is just part of a larger trend of the Kamala campaign having a difficult time divorcing itself from where she was in 2019. And I think one of the big sticking points for a lot of voters, when they say they don't know a lot about who Kamala Harris is, it's because she has never really provided a cogent, clear explanation of why she has shifted so dramatically. She said that she has, that her values haven't changed, that she's had conversations with people, but I think people want to hear her say, like, on immigration, how exactly did you come to the conclusion that you no longer want to decriminalize illegal immigration, you no longer want to give illegal immigrants free sex changes and driver's licenses, you don't want to abolish ICE, all of those positions are gone, and your answer to that is, well, I prosecuted transnational gangs when I was AG. Like, that's just not good enough.
Well, in the vice president's defense, I think she has been very forward in saying, listen, when I'm a senator of California and advocating for what the vast majority of Californians want, which is likely on the more liberal side of the spectrum when it comes to issues, that's my role in Washington, is to be an advocate for that state. And then you see that all the time with candidates then pivoting to a national campaign.
The problem with that, Kevin, is that she was running for president when she took a lot of these positions, right?
Well, and again, the Democratic Party, just those last couple of cycles, with the rise of and the energy behind Bernie Sanders, those were the animating elements of my party. Now, I'm a Joe Biden guy, right? So, I was a surrogate for the president, and that's my politics. But again, I think it was a calculation of seeing where the Democratic Party was at and the energy of the Democratic Party and playing into that more than necessarily, where her positions are now.
Yeah, so Bernie was probably right when he said that she was doing it because of...
It was a very honest moment from the Vermont.
It was, yeah. And see, I think voters want to know, is it a political calculation or have you had a real transformation in your ideology? And I think she's been kind of like trying to tiptoe that line, and that's what comes across as very inauthentic. Maybe if she just admitted, like, hey guys, I'm a populist, I'll take whatever position the majority of my voters want. I don't know, maybe that gets her more respect than...
and we'll see if voters really discredit her on that element. I think hopefully, more voters out there are saying, I want, not a rigid elected official. Donald Trump has had maybe 18 different opinions over the course of 40 years on the question of abortion and things like that, and not the rigid framework that so many people, the attacks on John Kerry for flip-flopping and things like that, that were so effective in 2004. We'll see if the American voter wants a more pragmatic person to be that commander-in-chief.
Yeah, and I will say a more effective political argument from the Trump campaign in terms of her flip-flopping would be she's really the 2019 Kamala, and she's just saying this to get elected, and then she's going to do all the radical stuff that
and they
she's
tried that
doing,
with, Comrade Kamala and things like that, trying to tie her and Tim Walz to some of the more liberal policies. I don't think that actually has really changed the dynamics so much. And the fact that, the New York Times Siena poll says that now by a small number, but a number nonetheless, that Kamala Harris represents the candidate of change over Donald Trump. It's just 2 points, but that she's been able to take that mantle as the incumbent vice president is also pretty interesting too.
That is fascinating. All right, unfortunately, that's it for us. That's all the time we have. It's going to do it for us this week on Rising. But as always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Bye. See you next week.